I think joy is different from happiness. I feel like happiness is something you can get at 7-Eleven, and joy is something that you earn and work for and takes practice. I feel like joy has legs. I feel like joy has feet. I feel like joy has roots. I feel like joy creates space and allows room for more than just a good day. I think joy is an attitude. I think joy is a perspective. And I think joy is a lens through which I live and look at my life.
And I think this week I've been reflecting on a lot of my own internal struggles with joy and my internal understanding of what joy is and what it should be. And I think I've come to this realization, especially with this whole, with the way my feelings have been in turmoil this week, that what if the issue isn't that we struggle to feel joy, but what if we think that we're supposed to exist in joy all the time? But if you're new here, hi, I'm Sharon, and this is Sharon Unfiltered, where I explore media, fashion, politics, and everything in between. But essentially, the topic for this week is we cannot live in constant joy and we shouldn't aspire to. And I came across this topic just when I was thinking of reflecting on my own internal struggles with joy, especially this week, but also when I was watching The Good Place again. And The Good Place follows four characters, Erna, Jason, Tahani, and Chidi, who accidentally end up in the quote unquote good place, even though they've done horrible deeds all throughout their time on Earth, essentially. But so they spend like a good 4 seasons actually trying to get to the actual good place because they start in hell, but they're struggling and they go through numerous challenges, end up in a good place. But when they reach the good place, where it's supposed to be quote unquote heaven, and people have been there for centuries on end, because they've been so happy for so long, they become numb. So, and it really brings this question in: if joy is stretched for eternity, is that still joy? At least for me, I thought I had a definite answer to the question where I thought that joy can only be appreciated when it's split into doses that we enjoy slowly and subtly. But I really want to bring in the work of what Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning. He says happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. Frankl essentially argues that happiness is the byproduct of meaning, not this permanent state that we live in or that we can force. That happiness must happen naturally for us to innately feel that we're deserving or appreciate happiness. And happiness does not make any sense without the meaning we place on it either. And when joy becomes the goal of life itself, instead of just experiencing and understanding the human experience, joy collapses. And I also want to quote Albert Camus, who wrote, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." So, not necessarily getting the thing we always wanted, or I think for a lot of us, we think when the goal is what's going to provide us joy and happiness. But Camus argues that it's not necessarily the goal itself, but the journey and the struggles we go through in that journey that really provides us with innate joy. And we see that a lot in The Good Place. Although they struggle for 4 seasons to get to the good place, they grow so much morally, but they also grow in friendship. And whether they realized it or not, that was the true joy, not necessarily reaching good place, because then when they reach a good place, a lot of them decide, oh, they're going to leave. For instance, Chi decides to leave and like restart himself on Earth again. And you kind of realize this goal, which was the good place for them, is nice, but isn't necessarily what provides them with joy. I also think joy requires tension between what we are striving to achieve and our actual goal. And that constant tension in the steps or the closer we get to our goal gives us joy, not necessarily the goal itself. But I also want to reflect on something I've learned in psychology, which is hedonic adaptation in the way we adjust, we normalize, and we flatten. So when I think of how sometimes I do feel inadequate and I do feel compare myself to other people, but then if I compared myself to my own previous self, I would be quite joyful and proud in that instance. But because I've normalized how much I achieve my goals or how much better I've become, I don't take enough time to appreciate every other person I've been before I was this person who achieved this goal or was close to my goal. And Aristotle distinguishes between pleasure and flourishing. He wrote about this in the Nicomachean, I'm probably butchering this, Nicomachean Ethics, which he says happiness depends upon ourselves, but he wasn't necessarily talking about mood in which happiness or joy is something that you can turn on and off, but he meant about virtue and activity and back to the, I guess, meaning that we put on life and what we take out of it. The more we put meaning or the less we put meaning or something, or what we essentially place meaning in, is what gives us joy. And pleasure is episodic and flourishing is practiced when we start to put meaning on the right things in life. Also want to explore Buddhist teachings, and I want to talk about the Buddha teaches on impermanence, which is called anicca, which reminds us that joy arises but joy also passes. But the human itself, which is our flaw, is that we strive for constant or permanent joy. I think that itself sometimes is an innate flaw of the human existence, and that suffering comes not from passing but clinging. The more we hold to something or we attach ourselves to experience, I think it can create an innate level of suffering as well. And I also just wanted to quote something I wrote in my own writings, which was to demand permanent happiness in an permanent or imperfect world is to fight against reality itself. And I really want to link this back into dukkha, which is one of the teachings of Buddhism, which is that life contains suffering inevitably. And when we're honest about ourselves, I think it allows us to enjoy the human experience a lot more. I was speaking to a friend about this recently when I was exploring this topic throughout the week, because often at times these video essays come from struggles I go throughout the week or things I discuss with my friends. And when I brought it up, she automatically thought that the lack of joy or the default of not having joy was sadness and suffering. But I had to disagree. I said the human experience is so complex in the emotions that obviously suffering will happen in the human life because life is innately unfair. But the the lack of joy does not mean that it's automatically suffering, or the default of no joy does not mean it's suffering. We explore so many emotions every day, like confusion, sadness, happiness, um, anger. Like there's so many other emotions outside of joy that I think we need to feel as a human, part of the human experience, to really understand and really enjoy or know when we have joy in our lives and put meaning on joy essentially. And I think this links back to something I previously said, in which suffering comes from our attachment and this willingness to cling. I think joy is only so joyful or so meaningful when we know that this moment is fleeting, that I may never experience this kind of thing ever again, this type of joy ever again. I may never laugh this much ever again. And I think that makes the experience of when you have joy in your life so much more meaningful. But trying to cling on and attach to it can only cause suffering essentially. And we see this as well when Eleanor and Chidi are, when Chidi wants to leave the good place, and Eleanor and Chidi are a couple in a good place at this point, and Eleanor does not want him to leave because she's like, what's so wrong with our life in the good place? And Chidi's like, but it's this constant same every day of, oh, I know it's gonna happen because I get innate joy from just like whatever this good place is, like all the situations, all the scenarios we can ever go through, I've gone through this good place. And Eleanor kind of has this level of innate suffering because she's clinging on to this idea of them being a couple forever in this good place, or she's clinging on to this perfect moment where they've had so much joy. But in that clinging, she's also creating turmoil within herself that she refuses to let go. I understand that that moment of joy was precious because it was that moment of joy, but it doesn't exist right now. Something else I really wanted to explore was just joy also as a verb. Bell Hooks talks and discusses about love as a verb, I think, and in which love isn't just something that exists, but it's also something that you act and that you do. I think the same thing can be applied to joy as well. And in All About Love by Bell Hooks, she says love is as love does. Love is an act of will, not necessarily a feeling, but love is a praxis. And I think it can be both, but I believe love should be more of a practice rather than just a feeling. You can have feelings of love, but if you never act on them, then how do other people know that you love them? Or how do you know that you love yourself, in fact? But I think the same thing can be said about joy. And joy can't just be this permanent emotional high and just this feeling. But I think we can act as joy, or we can have actions of joy, like paying attention to the people around us, or being grateful or having gratitude for this moment of joy, but also just being present. I think a lot of aspiration towards joy and having permanent joy is aspirational of looking towards the future. And when I'm in this future, and when I have this thing, I will be so happy and I will just be so joyful. But what about right now? I think for me, for a long time, how I dealt with suffering and sadness and these negative emotions was to look forward to the future, distract myself in the future rather than being present in the moment. I think sometimes we underestimate the power of lingering and sitting in our emotions as well. We think we see sitting in our emotions or lingering as such this negative thing, and it can be if you sit in your emotions for too long, but it can also be a really good exercise of emotional regulation. I think emotional regulation is one of the things we often lack as human beings, and it is a human flaw as well, in which I distract myself so much for the future. I don't want to exist in the present. And even though the present can be sad and there's suffering and there's all these negative emotions, by being present and sitting in my emotions, I know how to be present, sit in also joy and happiness. But if I never sit in my emotions, I'm constantly striving towards a future. So even when I do have joy in my life, I don't know how to sit in it. And I want to quote psychologist Michele. I'm not saying his second name because I feel like I'm going to butcher it. But he says the best moments in our lives are not passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur when the person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. And I think for me, I took this as joy isn't ease, but joy is rather engagement and engaging in the present and our surroundings. Finally, I wanted to explore the internal and the external. I think at times we think the internal versus the external is a way to exist and have joy, but I think internal and external work together, whereas internal feelings of joy can lead to external outputs of joy, and vice versa, where external outputs of joy and actions of joy can lead to internal feelings of joy. And I want to quote William James in what he wrote in The Varieties of Religious Experience. The greatest discovery of a generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitudes. And I think he talks about the equal balance of external and internal, that by changing your attitudes and being joyful outwardly, I incite or give myself permission to have feelings of joy internally. And likewise, I also want to quote Audre Lorde, in which she says, the sharing of joy forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding how much of what is not shared. And I want to end this on back on what the topic was, that joy isn't constant, and I don't think it should be, but also that joy can be connective and relational. And joy is this precious thing because it exists in scarcity. And not just understanding joy, but understanding the human experience and all the other emotions we feel. I think we are supposed to live fully, and that's how we can engage with every emotion fully. So if we cannot engage with sadness or grief or rest fully, how are we supposed to engage with joy fully as well? And so in my understanding, I don't think joy is this permanent destination, but perhaps a visitor in which we come in and out and we visit the place, like, and we go on holiday to that place, but not necessarily stay and linger so much in it or cling to it in a way that when we cling to too much of joy, it becomes suffering all over again. But yeah, that has been my, I guess, yap or video essay of this week. And if you really liked this, please share, comment, subscribe. But I'll see you guys next week.
Look at the camera, flash, smile at the camera, flash, look at everybody, big eyes, say nothing, stars don't do, stars just be.